Good morning, and I'm happy to be here with friend and longtime Great Connections advisor, Stephen Hicks. This is Marsha Enright from the Great Connections. We're an organization that offers innovative educational programs to help young people build lives of creative achievement and adventure. Please visit our website at thegreatconnections.org. So Stephen's been a longtime friend and an advisor of our organization, and he's a professor of philosophy at Rockford University for how many years, Stephen?
Many. Closing on, I finished my PhD work in '92, and so was eligible for tenure track positions, and that's when I came. So 28.
28 years. Yeah, I was guessing 30, so I guess I was pretty close. And he's quite famous in the intellectual world and even beyond that for his book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, and many articles on entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial education, including a Wall Street Journal article called What Entrepreneurship Can Teach Us About Life. His philosophy of education course, which is available free online at YouTube, and is now being turned into a book called 8 Philosophies of Education with him and his co-author, Andrew Colgan. It's going to come out soon. Do you know when?
No.
Okay.
We just finished the manuscript, so it's in complete draft form. So the next step will be publisher contacts.
Very good. Very good. Well, I look forward to it because I know that I've seen some of the work online and it's superb as always. Stephen is can't be beat for being a great explainer of history, intellectual history, and analyzing what's gone on with ideas. Highly recommend him and his podcast. Open College. Yeah, sorry, it was escaping me.
Produced out of my hometown in Toronto by a very fine production team up there, so they make my job easy.
They do a wonderful job with it, but your content is superb. Half an hour, you're going to learn a lot if you listen to him. I will put all the information about his books, his YouTube channel, his podcast in the notes to this conversation. So if you want to look at that, viewers, I hope you do. Okay, so I've asked you here today, Stephen, because you've been a philosophy professor in the Midwest at Rockford University for many, many years. As we said, I guess 30, but you said 28. What kind of students do you teach, and what changes have you seen in them over time?
Yeah. Well, my university comes out of the liberal arts college tradition. So Rockford was founded in the 1840s. I think 1847 the college was founded. Mm-hmm. So it's got a long tradition of small classes and intensive relationships between the professors and the students. So we're a private institution and we are not affiliated with any religious institutions. So we get students who are serious about their education because we're charging them a significant amount of money. Mm-hmm. So they come with strong motivation to get a good education, and they know there's something about the liberal arts. They don't want a narrow technical education as valuable as that can be. At the same time, Rockford University, I think of it as a solid middle of the pack university. We're not an elite institution. Mm-hmm. So we tend to get students who are intelligent and solid, but they're not the kinds of students who are going to go to Harvard or Stanford and so on. Although we do tend to get a significant minority of students who could perform well at Harvard or Stanford or any university, but they tend to be the ones who were screw-ups in high school. That might be too strong. Mm-hmm. But they weren't serious about their education. They're smart, but they were out partying and so on. Mm-hmm. And so their grades are not strong, but nonetheless, they have that native intelligence, and then they end up at Rockford University for whatever reason. So it's a real mix.
Well, and there's a lot of very intelligent students who, for one reason or another, haven't done the extracurriculars or taken all the AP courses, right. Or they didn't have good advice that makes it difficult for them to get into these elite schools. So.
Yeah. Or another constituent is students who are in the area but tied here geographically. They have elderly parents, or they have a job and they're going to university at the same time. So they're very hardworking, intelligent, and so on. But yeah, so they're a good group. Of course, there's always students who do end up. It's a small minority, fortunately for us. Well, I'm not really sure why they're at university, and
Oh, yeah, right.
so they don't perform very well. But I think that's a much smaller percentage than standard state schools.
Well, and so have you seen a change in the students over the years?
Well, yes, I think so. Yeah, I'm trying not to turn into one of those curmudgeonly older professors talking about the younger generation, right?
Right,
And
right,
so,
right. Yeah.
there is a difference. I'm noticing a resilience difference among the students. There's a lot of failure that is built into good education. You have to try stuff and it doesn't work out and you come back. But I've noticed that students more frequently now give up sooner.
Oh.
I've got some speculations about why that might be. So one of the things I've always done is with my students when they write essays is I will send them feedback on their essays and always give them an opportunity. If you want to work on revising your essay as many times as you want, I will work with it and we will take it as far as you go. And students would more frequently take me up on that offer 20 years ago and do multiple iterations. And now it's a rarer phenomenon of students who will do that, and they might do it one time rather than multiple times. So that's an interesting option. One thing I've noticed is an increasing gap between international students and kind of homegrown American students, in that almost always the rate of redoing work and improving work among the international students is much higher than Native American students. So I think it speaks not to intelligence, but to motivation and seriousness levels. So there is that. And then the other thing is, the other side of the resilience is a kind of self-responsibility notion. The idea, you come to university, and do you think that it's up to you to learn the system and to figure out what you need to do successfully to navigate the university system in general and your courses in particular, in contrast to a student who comes and says, what can you do for me? And kind of overstating it, but can you hold my hand and guide me through everything and so on. So there does seem to be a shifting in a more hand-holding direction.
And that goes along with the lack of resilience, because people who are more confident that they can take care of things themselves don't feel like they need that.
Right, or they don't want that. They want to find their own way. Yes, for sure.
Do you have any evidence about what's causing this, or any ideas about it?
Well, I have ideas, but I haven't documented the evidence. So I think a lot of it is, we talk about helicopter parenting and the safe spaces now phenomenon in university, but there does seem to have been over the last 20 years a lack of letting students, when they are children, go off and do their own thing. I think to the extent that we are shifting in the direction of cocooning children, then that's going to show up 10 years, 20 years later in university. So I think that's a real social phenomenon. Inside the schools, I think there has been a shift to a much more scripted kind of education. Students are following a recipe, they're following directions, and to the extent that you go further down that road, then by the time one gets to university, particularly in I think a liberal arts context where it's supposed to be about you are a free, self-responsible agent, we're going to treat you as an adult, that's a more difficult transition for students as well.
It reminds me of something that happened to me about 40 years ago, which was I was working for a pharmacology professor at a medical school, and the president of the medical school class came in to ask what should they study for the final. And the professor gave a beautiful explanation in principle of what they should study for the final. At the end of the conversation, the president of the class said, "But Dr. Nair, what should we study?" And I was just like doing this because he wanted the formula. He wanted the exact
right.
directions about what to do. And I guess this attitude has gone down into lower school.
Kind of one example I noticed over many years. I come out of the philosophy tradition, and we like to pat ourselves on the back as being the queen of all of the humanities, or the king, whichever metaphor you like. But what's drilled into you there is that all of the issues are complicated, all of the issues are controversial, and you drill yourself in looking at the best arguments for any position, as well as then the best counter arguments against that position, seeking out what the alternatives are, and so that methodology becomes second nature. And then, of course, if you're a decent philosopher, your ultimate judgment call is your own judgment call. I'm a philosopher in my own right. I'm not just a scribe for other people's answers. So that becomes second nature. But I do remember early in my teaching career, I was teaching some biomedical ethics courses, and we have a very strong nursing program. And this will be partly a criticism of nursing education, but also a testament to the nursing students that I was teaching. Is we would be doing biomedical ethics, all of these controversial, very complicated issues about euthanasia and abortion and informed consent and so on. And the first midterm test would come along, or the first test would come along, and I would give them philosophy type questions for them to answer. And they almost always did very poorly on the first test because they weren't used to that style of thinking, that there's arguments, counter arguments, and then having looked at both of those, what do you think, and work it out for yourself as what the best answer was, because their education had been up to that point very scripted. Here are the 208 bones in the human body, and this, and memorize them and regurgitate them. As a much more mechanical, rubric-oriented education. So the style of thinking humanistically and philosophically was quite alien to them. But then, to their credit, what I found is almost always the nursing students would treat it as a science experiment. Okay, we didn't do very well on this science experiment, learning experiment. What are we doing wrong? What do we need to do? And then they would come and sit down, and you could see their eyes open and say, okay, yes, now we understand it. And they would get in together in their study groups, and they would start saying, okay, you're going to argue this side, we're going to argue this side, we're going to have this little debate, and then we're going to be ready. And they almost all did very well on the subsequent tests. I think that's kind of ideal, and that's in large part what liberal education should be doing. But to go back to the first question about resilience, I'm finding outside of the nursing students, there's a lot of students coming out of high school and so on, for whom that still is very alien to them. For various reasons, they don't have the resources to be able to take on that project.
And it's such a contrast. I mean, it's the reason why organizations like Let Grow started to inform parents about all the ways in which children and teenagers can be so much more resilient, and how to encourage them in that. I remember reading an article on there about two kids. It was a celebratory article. Two kids in 1905 who traveled, 5 years old and 13 years old, who traveled from the Midwest to Washington, D.C. by themselves. And the paper thought this was a great thing. And then they later traveled to San Francisco by themselves. And this was just wonderful. I mean, can you imagine today? Oh my gosh.
Right. Yes, that's right. That reminds me of an anecdote about Richard Branson, the famous British entrepreneur.
Virgin Atlantic,
Yeah, that's right. Apparently his parents, and especially his mother in this particular case, thought he was at the same time a disciplinary problem, but then also a little bit too sheltered. So one of the things she did was take him far from home, and basically drop him off and say, he was only like 6 years old. And say, all right, find your own way home. And he did. did,
Yeah.
but he cites this as one of the great learning experiences.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Now to go back to our contemporary times, we'd be more likely to look
Be
askance
arrested.
for doing that. Yes, and
No, the parents would be
it's
arrested.
filed away from her for
I
being
mean,
a
that
bad.
happened, a few years ago with some parents who had their 11-year-old and like 11 and 8-year-old at a park walk home by themselves. They got
Yeah.
turned in by some neighbor
Yeah.
and got in trouble. So it's
Right.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So it's hard to quantify a lot of these things, but the general question you're asking is there does seem to be a generational shift. Now there are some greater awareness of the problems and the long-term consequences, and there's some pushback in other organizations, including some European organizations, especially in Finland and Germany, that are trying to work on more resilience and exposure, getting away from the helicoptering.
Mm-hmm. For parents, to teach parents to do that. Yeah. And but it almost seems like an opportunity for the colleges to have some classes or activity. I mean, really activities about it would be best,
Yeah,
finding
well,
this
yeah,
a
it's an
problem.
opportunity. But I think colleges, some of them I think will see it as an opportunity. My sense right now is that most colleges and universities see it all as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
They're following the classic pattern of being an entrenched institution, right, locked into certain ways of doing things. And it's very hard for hidebound conservative institutions to think outside the box. So
That's true.
the sense is that only a minority will reinvent themselves, but rather what will be more likely to happen is new kinds of educational institutions will be developed and replace a lot of traditional colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm. That's to be hoped.
Well, yes.
Yeah, that's to be hoped. So you talked about, you think that the way that the students have been educated, they're missing out on resilience. Is there anything else they're missing out on their education, do you think, before when they arrive at your class?
Well, I think resilience, I think, is a part of it. I think another element is that education has become more politicized
Mm-hmm.
in a certain direction, but politicized is too narrow because it's
Mm-hmm.
also a broader set of values and ideological elements of which politics is a component. But students are not getting as much the sense that the world is complicated and that on all of the big normative issues especially, there is legitimate controversy and that they need to be exposed to many or all sides of an argument. Instead, they're taught a script, and that script is typically one or a very narrow range of viewpoints right, within that script. And they are, in many cases, actively discouraged from seeking out alternative viewpoints. So in that case, then students do not develop any critical thinking
Mm-hmm.
skills. And then to the extent that it becomes the viewpoint that they're only hearing from their teachers, the viewpoint that they're hearing from their peers who imbibe that view, then fear comes to be a more dominant part of their education. Because it's hard to go against the crowd. It's hard to challenge the teachers at the best of times when you're a developing mind. And so fear, and often it's a soft fear, but that can cripple a person's cognitive development. So they're unwilling to challenge in addition to not having developed the cognitive skills to challenge.
Mm-hmm. What about the content of what they're learning? The difference?
Well, again, I don't have very good numbers to it because I'm a university teacher, so I'm seeing students who are coming out of the pipeline, so to speak. But the content does seem to be scripted and narrower. The thing that is more important to me is the cognitive style.
Mm-hmm.
So students who are aware that there is controversy, that while we do know a lot of stuff, there's a huge amount of stuff that we don't yet know.
Mm-hmm.
And so having that attitude of curiosity and being willing to seek out new and unknown, and being comfortable with the idea that there's just a huge amount that's not known, that there's not somebody out there, the teacher, or that I can just look it up at the back of the book what the answer is, that I'm an intellectual seeker or an intellectual entrepreneur. That cognitive style, I think, is the more important thing, and that's lacking, aside from the narrower range of education. So, for example, one thing I do notice is, at my university, for example, we have Bachelor of Science degrees and we have Bachelor of Arts degrees. And Bachelor of Arts degrees has a foreign language requirement. And the foreign language requirement was always a harder sell, 20 years more years ago, but it's become an increasingly harder sell. So the idea that that I want to learn more than one language, so that I can, for all of the obvious benefits of learning another language, fewer students seem interested in doing so 20 years later. So that is one thing that we can document, is the number of students who are seeking out the Bachelor of Arts degree has gone down. Instead, they're looking for the easier requirement in the foreign languages. The other thing I would say is math education. So part of a liberal arts university is we want students to be kind of that Renaissance man or woman ideal of knowing a little bit about a lot of things. And so know a lot about math and science and the arts and humanities and history and languages and culture and so forth, in order to consider yourself a wide-ranging education. And so, yes, it sounds like a lot of work, and math is hard, and history might not be very interesting, and foreign languages is another kind of challenge. But it seems to be even more forthright in this generation of students who don't even see the need to learn math. It's not just they came to believe, say, when they were in 9th or 10th grade and things went up a level of abstraction, I'm not a math person, but I still think math is important, and I'm going to stick it out, and I'm going to learn something about statistics and algebra and so on. Whereas now the more common attitude, again, I'm not putting numbers to this, is that I just don't need to know math. I don't need to know foreign languages. I can just get this narrower education, and that's fine.
It's just a getting through. Let me just find the easiest way to get through.
Yeah, and so a certain kind of credentialism seems to have replaced, the idea of a liberal arts education. So,
yeah, I guess so. Math and was one of the things you think in foreign language, and I guess I was asking about what knowledge do you think is missing? Are they not as knowledgeable about certain things as students used to be?
Well, yes. Well, I do think foreign language counts as a kind of knowledge, because typically with that comes a lot of literature and history and geography and so on. And the same thing for math. While math can be taught, I think, badly as just a series of formal systems and manipulative things, math is about solving real world problems. And so when you learn math, you work on biology and physics and statistics and social sciences. So the content is always integrated. So there is an impoverishment of content that goes along with that. The other one I think I would cite is history education. And I think history can always, again, be badly taught. It's just a bunch of names and dates and so on, instead of all these stories about incredibly interesting human beings doing all sorts of things. and this I think comes closer to a philosophical issue, that a lot of history content education has become impoverished because even many people in the history profession have come to believe that it's irrelevant. So the idea of the standard cliche, but absolutely true cliche, is that we need to learn from history, and if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. But built into that idea is that there are some constants in human beings, that despite all of the cultural differences and so on, human beings do share a common identity, a biological identity, a psychological identity, and that manifests itself in certain constants about values and the kinds of cooperations and conflicts that can arise. So, we can learn from the Egyptians and the Greeks and the ancient Chinese and so on. And aside from the interesting exotic elements, we can relate and apply the lessons of Chinese history or Greek history to our own time. But one of the philosophical fashions, that's to trivialize it too much, has been the idea that people are just fundamentally different, that culture is a bottom line, that human beings are more like plasticine, born into different cultures that are completely different from each other. And so people come to think completely differently, they have completely different values, and that we can't really even understand other people. And so really the only thing we need to do is learn our own culture so that we can navigate within our own culture. But then if you come to believe that, then the idea that we're going to study the Greeks or we're going to study Charlemagne, it seems to be irrelevant, because that's a completely different culture. There's nothing that we can possibly learn. And so then history becomes irrelevant and students don't learn as much history. And that then would be a content impoverishment.
You know what's ironically paradoxical about that philosophical position, that we can't understand people of other cultures, is how did the people who came up with that theory conclude that if they can't understand the other cultures?
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, there's always the internal self-contradictions of relativistic positions, right?
Yeah.
So that you are making a kind of knowledge claim. So I know these other cultures well enough to know that
Right.
these things can't be understood by
Exactly.
in that
How do
culture, but
you?
not in that culture.
Yeah.
So, yes. So
Exactly. So, why do you think studying the liberal arts is valuable for students, and what works should they be studying?
Yes. Well, the idea of the liberal arts goes back to the root concept of freedom. That the liberal arts are to free your mind.
Liberals coming from the same root as liberty.
Yes,
A lot of people don't realize that. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And the contrast, when the idea of liberal arts was being developed, there was a Greek version of it and a Roman version of it that was then lost through much of the Middle Ages, was against the idea that there is kind of one truth, and that all of the important truths are known, and they are held in the minds of authoritative individuals or written in an authoritative scripture book, and that you don't need any sort of intellectual freedom. Instead, all you need to do is be obedient to authority, to listen to your teacher and literally regurgitate what your teacher has said, or memorize the textbook and on your tests and essay regurgitate whatever it is. So the idea of liberal arts rose against that, which then is to say, while there may be many truths and important things that the ancients have learned, there still is a huge amount to be discovered, and only a certain kind of mind that is open to new experiences, new data, is going to be, and willing to look at that data from multiple perspectives, is going to be to acquire new knowledge. Also, part of that was that even to the extent that the traditional views are correct, it really doesn't do you any good if you are merely parroting that view. You really have to be free to challenge that view and ask all of the kinds of questions about that view that intelligent people are going to ask about the received view, so that you freely in your own mind can see why that traditional view is true, if it is true. So you need to have freedom intellectually to be able to challenge the received views, the freedom to look at alternative views, the freedom to go out and explore new territories in order to become the kind of person who can function well in the world. And that then works with a content claim that the world is very complicated. And so there are disciplines that have been developed in law, in medicine, in theology, in philosophy, in history, in languages, in culture, and in the emerging sciences. And so if you're going to really be interested in the truth about the world, you need to know all of those disciplines. And so a broad-ranging content education, as well as that open-minded, active inquiry inquiry, criticism, and debate methodology comes to be characteristic of the liberal education. So then, why do I think that is important? Well, because that is the constant human condition.
Yeah.
Now, 600 or 700 years ago, past the Renaissance. So, again, it's a cliche, but we say things like the more books I read, the more books I know I need to read, or the
Right.
more I know, the more I realize how much more there is to learn that is out there. So, being the kind of person who is interested in the whole world and actively seeking out the knowledge from the whole world, and having the cognitive habits of mind to be able to think critically about everything that's going on, that's a constant. So it's not set in stone. We are adding new sciences all the time. I wish that the arts were more innovative than they are, but we have all of these wonderful new artistic media. That's all an open-ended potential. And we know also in our relationships, relationships are complicated. And there's lots of types of human relationships and more that are now available to us, but a certain kind of person, a liberally educated person, is going to be the kind of person who can lead the most flourishing life. So that's the general pitch. Now, then you ask the second part of your question, I think is the hard part. What general or what works should students be reading? Here, I think it's very hard because there's two things. One is to say that we're all human beings, and so there's a certain set of core knowledge that we might all want to be exposed to. So we all need to know how to read, how to write, how to speak well. It's important if you're going to be functional in your culture to know your culture's basic institutions and basic beliefs. Even not that you have to agree with all of them, but just to be able to operate with the people in your cultural group. And then to the extent that we are in a more global culture, again, that cliche is true, but increasingly true as the modern world develops, knowing something about all of the different cultures that are out there in order to be able to function as a practical exercise. So I think then we can say, reading, writing, speaking, thinking skills methodologically, that's common, the common universal part of anyone's education. So logic, math, and all of the communication skills and so on. Then I would say, some understanding of the different political systems that are out there, the different economic systems, the different religious and philosophical systems that are out there. That should be a common part of anyone's heritage. But beyond that, I think it's difficult to say, because the other thing that education needs to pay attention to is not the ways in which we are all the same, but the ways in which we are all unique individuals. Very quickly at a young age, students start to have their own values, their own preferences, and finding their own paths and following their own paths through their life. So some students are clearly more of an engineering mindset. They like taking things apart. Some are more musical, some are more artistic, some are more scientific, some are more just interested in reading, some are interested in writing. And education well done needs to be customized to let each individual pursue his or her own path. And my default position is to have parents and teachers work as individually as possible with students. Of course, behind that, though, I do think that wherever your path is, if you follow music or you follow history, you're going to end up doing all of the other stuff anyway, because music takes you into mathematics, it takes you into emotional expression. There's a whole history of music. There's all the different cultural traditions in music. There's all of the science and engineering that goes into making musical instruments. Anybody who's passionate about music is going to end up getting a full liberal arts education anyway. And I think the same thing happens wherever you start, because it's all connected.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. We still have thousands of brilliant, creative people working in the U.S. on technology, on business, on sports. how is their lack of education in the liberal arts affecting them?
Yeah. I think I would parse that question out a little bit. I think despite all of the flaws of the contemporary system, students still do get a good education. What they do not get is good schooling.
Mm,
And I think that despite the very rigid, narrow kind of education and actually demotivating and in many cases dehumanizing education that students are exposed to in formal schooling, outside of school,
mhm,
American culture, and broadly Western culture, and now global culture is very rich with opportunities and so on. So it's a bit of a stereotype again, but the stereotype is true. If you say, what does school mean to you when I say that word? You say,
mm,
what's the school day like?
mhm,
Vast majority of us, the image that is coming to mind is rows of desks,
mhm,
right? And students then sit in a place, and they typically sit in the same seat day
mhm,
in, day out for the entire school year.
mhm,
And all of the students then listen to the teacher and they make their notes, right? And they do what the teacher tells them to do. And the teacher might lecture to them. And I'm not opposed to lectures. There can be great lecture,
mhm,
but that's only one tool. But the teacher has the answers, and your job is to learn what the teacher tells you. Or everybody's working on the textbook, but they're all doing the same problem at the same time, in the same way, and they have to
mhm,
finish at the same time. But
yeah,
then that communicates a certain model of passivity,
mhm,
even to the point, where you want to go to the bathroom, right? You have to ask permission to go to
yeah,
the bathroom. Kind of
yeah,
mildly dehumanizing sort
mhm,
of thing. But then you think, what's that like for a young child for day in, day out, for a whole school year? Sit
mm,
in rows and do the same thing that everybody else is doing. And
mhm,
you better pass the test. If you fail, then we will come down hard on you, a certain
yeah,
attitude of failure. And you do that for a year, another year, another year, another year, another year. That is not education. That
mm,
is that is the opposite of education. So my heart goes out to all of those students who rebel,
mhm,
particularly as they are going through adolescence and find various ways to subvert the system.
mhm. Ferris Bueller.
That's right, to keep some flame. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Ferris Bueller should be the role model, right? The hero to everyone. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good. Now I want to watch that movie again. But despite all of that, outside of formal schooling, culture is rich, partly because we're a rich culture, but kids are taking all sorts of music lessons and sports lessons and they do learn a huge amount from video games and from
Yeah,
television, and they teach each other with all of these social media tools. I'm a big fan of pretty much all of those things. I
mhm,
think the benefits of them vastly outweigh the downsides as well. So we do still have a culture that broadly celebrates the hero's journey, finding
mhm,
your way.
yeah,
You're special, and so on. So, despite the dehumanizing, in many cases, miseducation or anti-education in formal schooling, we still do have a rich educational
I
culture, and I
I
think
see
that's
what you
why
mean.
we still are able to have a significant minority of students who are very innovative
Mhm,
and so. The other thing I think is despite recent years, the steady stream of immigrants who come in
mhm, mhm,
still do have an entrepreneurial, generally immigration-friendly culture.
mhm,
And and there is some documentation of this, that the people who tend to be the most creative and the most
mhm,
innovative, very high percentage of them are
yeah.
immigrants. So to the extent that we succeed in attracting them from around the world, we can assimilate them and benefit them.
Lucky in that respect. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let's hope that we can keep the culture to be as thriving and full of information and learning opportunities as possible
Yeah.
uh, to help counteract this other trend.
The other anecdote I would throw out there, and it's an overstatement, but it's beautifully stated. It was a remark from some European entrepreneurs
Mhm,
who were very cosmopolitan. They were also doing business in the United States and basically all over the world. And the comment essentially, and I heard this in a couple of different forms, to say, America has the worst 18-year-olds in the world in terms of coming out of formal schooling, right, what they're ready for life and so forth. But America has the best 30-year-olds in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what they were basically saying is the American school system is crap.
Yes.
But once students out of the American school system and into the business world, America has the best business culture in the world. And those students, basically, they get their education in their 20s and they become outstanding.
The market ends up normalizing them in that respect.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, Michael Barone wrote a book about that called Hard America, Soft America, or Soft America, Hard America. And
yeah, I'm not familiar with it, but
yeah, about 15 years ago, I think I read that. So it struck me as completely true, seeing what goes on, you know. So, but that was interesting about the Germans observing it. I mean, certainly one of the things you hear from immigrants that come here, is that there's no place like the U.S. for being able to start wherever you are. It doesn't matter what social position you have, what connections you have, and if you work hard, being able to rise to what other, you know, to heights. And you'll hear that over and over from people from all kinds of different countries who say, no, it's not possible in another country. So it's not possible in my home country.
Yeah, no, I'm big on the immigrants, and they're genuinely recognizing why America still is an exceptional place. So to come back to formal education and your earlier question, I'm just reminded of another anecdote. One of the things that I will frequently do, aside from offering students rewrites of their essays and working with them, is, you know, makeup tests on exams. And every year I teach a logic course, and the logic course, for some reason, is almost always 50% homegrown American kids and 50% immigrants. And I've noticed a pattern that typically the first logic test, nobody does that well on it. And so I always offer a makeup test. And almost always, 100% of the foreign students will take the makeup tests. And it's rare that an American student will take the makeup test. So you know, you take your first logic test and you get a C on it. So if your mindset is, oh, I got a C, I guess I'm okay with that C. I will take the makeup test. That's one thing. And it's disturbing, that level of complacency. So the immigrant students, even if they are not geniuses, nonetheless, they have the work ethic. They got a C. Oh, I'm not happy with this, so I'm going to take that makeup test.
Right.
So.
Well, you know, it's partly, I think the point of view of the American student is, I'm just trying to get through to get my credential of having a college degree. I'm not really interested. They've learned from earlier education that authorities don't really care if you actually know the stuff or you're interested in learning, just if you're giving them back what they want to hear from you enough. So if you've learned enough of the information that you can give it back to them the way they want to hear it. I know I've seen this, where if you take an essay test and if you paraphrase whatever the subject is about in the essay test, often the person will be marked down for that. That what the person correcting the test is looking for is certain terms that were said in the course, instead of understanding of those terms.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first part of what you're saying is that compliance mindset that feeds into the credential. So there's just a certain set of expectations that other people have for me, my parents, my teachers, my future bosses, and so on. And my job just is to satisfy that, whatever I need to do to comply, instead of the more entrepreneurial mindset where I want to be the best person I can be and to be the fullest life I can be. So I see my education as an opportunity to grow as a human being. So that's a huge gulf.
Yes. And I mean, I think they've often been punished in a certain way if they try to do things their own way or try to do things out of the box.
Oh,
They're,
absolutely.
they're basically punished in the way the lower educational system has worked, you know.
Yes. Well, that's a dehumanization that is. There are a certain number of students, teachers, of course, who are not really teachers. They are ideologists in various sort of political, religious,
Mm-hmm.
environmental, right, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. They have their viewpoint, and yet any deviant student, they will punish that
Yeah.
person as well. A large amount of it, though, is institutionalization, where it's very hard for various institutional reasons to get rid of bad teachers,
Mm-hmm.
teachers who are really just there because it's a pretty good financial lifestyle, and you get the summers off, and there's very little accountability. So that kind of teacher just wants to teach a recipe, doesn't want to actually deal with the creative thinking students, and so they will find various ways to punish those students who are not just following the script.
Well, there's another practical reason why it happens, which is that the schools are being given money by the federal government depending on how many kids pass certain standardized tests. And so that puts the pressure on the teacher to get kids to be doing well on the standardized tests. And that disincentivizes teachers, even the ones who want to, from teaching outside of that framework and having the students do anything outside of that framework. I'm afraid that you have frozen.
Then
Oh,
you were appearing.
you froze there for a while. So
Okay, yeah, you froze from me. So okay, but we're back now.
yeah. Anyway, all
So
right. Well,
disincentivizing. Go
oh,
ahead.
I was saying it disincentivizes teachers from encouraging the students to want to do things outside of what they need to do to take these standardized tests, because the
Oh,
teachers are
yes.
getting pressure from the administration to have their students, the maximum number of students, do well on the test so that they can get money from the federal government. And
Yeah.
that's a big problem. So
Yeah, unfortunately, well, I teach this course on philosophy of education, which is for students who are ambitious about their teaching careers. And I've had any number of students who stayed in touch over the years, and they will come out of school or university, age 22 or so, very ambitious and idealistic about their teaching career. And in some cases, they're back 5 years later to get another degree because they've been so demoralized by the system that
mm-hmm,
they realize they just don't want to be teachers anymore. They're going
mm-hmm,
to go and into some other field. So yes, and it's for exactly the reasons that you're talking about.
mm-hmm. So I just want to move on because I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to go on to a last question I had for you, which is, or I got a notification. I can't figure out how to turn it off.
We're very popular.
Yeah. So I think you've been a shining example of objectivity in teaching. And one of my evidence of this everybody can know about is that you taught a course on Marxism that was online. You had recordings of it online. And some years ago, some reporter from Breitbart saw it and then wrote about you as you were a Marxist. But you had to straighten him out about that because, of course, no, you're a classical liberal. And in terms of your own views.
Fun anecdote, yeah.
What?
It is a fun anecdote, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So you did such a wonderful job of presenting Marxism in a very balanced and objective way that he was obviously fooled about that. So what do you think we as teachers can do to help students against teaching that lacks that kind of objectivity or is purposely slanted?
Yeah. Well, what I do, the way I do it is particularly with my freshman students or my first year students is just to affirm to them that when they go to university, they will have many kinds of professors. They will have some professors who are ideologists and just interested in indoctrination. and just to learn to recognize when you are dealing with that kind of teacher. And I recommend them as a matter of self-defense to plug into the student grapevine as soon as they can and get all of the information about professors. You know, if I make an argument for another kind of view, am I going to be downgraded by this professor or that professor? Actively avoid the indoctrinating professors and seek out the professors who are genuinely interested in education. And so then, I do tell them the mantra that by the time you are getting to higher education does mean something. All of the controversial, complicated issues are controversial and complicated for a reason. And when you are at university and beyond, you will recognize the people who are the experts in the field. They have disagreements with each other, and you need to know what those disagreements are. And good professors will expose you to what those disagreements are. And whatever the viewpoint is, good professors will welcome the criticisms and themselves point out what the criticisms are of those viewpoints. So become a savvy consumer as a student is an important point. The other thing I say to students is that if you're not getting that at university, make sure that you go online and actively seek out what the alternatives are, because you can find what the alternatives are, and that for your own strength of mind, almost any position can be given a good gloss and made to seem like a reasonable position and so forth. So to realize for yourself, whatever position you are hearing, there is criticism out there. There is another way of framing that data that's worth a look at. And so actively seek that out before you make up your own mind. So it used to be, there always are ideological teachers in any generation, and we have a lot more of them in this generation for various reasons. But to the extent that students are aware that there are alternatives, and that gets reinforced by at least some of their liberal arts oriented professors, they will get the message.
I had a thought to go along with it, but of course it fled.
The other thing that I typically do in my first year's classes is I make a point of never letting the students know what my views are, because they don't know me. I can say, just argue something well and you'll get a good grade, but they don't know me, whether I'm lying about that or not.
Sure.
So the idea is that they're not in a position to really know what my views on an issue are until they're up to speed on what the issues are, what the complicated complications are, what the range of positions are, and so on. So the way I always teach my first 2 years courses is, whatever the issue is, we're always reading two or more people from different perspectives. And it's just, here's the argument, here are the counter arguments, here's the other side's argument, here are the counter arguments, and I leave it at that. And at this point, now you're up to speed. Of course, you'll make up your own mind and so on. So the example of the Marxism is a good example of that. So part of my job is, whenever we cover something by Marx, is to make the arguments as strongly as possible, but also the criticisms of Marxism as well as that. So not until students are juniors and seniors that in classes and outside, I'll let them know what my views are, because then they know me and they know that I'm not going to downgrade them. So they're confident, but then they're more up to speed. So then typically what happens is we do the same thing. Here's the issue. Here are the arguments on one side, the arguments on this side, and now you're up to speed on that, but at a higher level. And then I will at that point say, I think this side is the correct side. Here's my reasons why, and why I think this criticism of the other side. Of course, I've got students from all over the religious, ideological, political, and so on.
Sure.
So they're typically stronger minded at that point, and they will wonderfully argue with me. That's
great.
That's good.
Oh, that's wonderful advice to the students, everything that you've said. And even I got an even further benefit, which is if students of anybody tries to pay attention to the best arguments from both sides of a controversy, they'll actually, if they see that, well, the other side has some reasonable ideas there or some reasons for what they're saying, then they're more inclined to have a good conversation with people from who take that point of view. So that you
Yes.
can actually have a productive conversation with them, because you're giving them the benefit of the doubt and saying, okay, I think, yeah, I can see where you have some merit to what you're saying. And then you can exchange the ideas and the information about it to try to get somewhere in a conversation.
Absolutely. So you mentioned my 8 Philosophies of Education book that's newly finished. My co-author, Andrew Colgan, he's a younger Canadian PhD in philosophy of education. But one of our motivations for that book is exactly the point that you're talking about. Those of us who are parents and teachers and going to be administrators in education, we're going to be having thousands of conversations about education,
Mm-hmm.
about what the content should be, what the methodology should be, teachers we should hire, how we assess the physical layout of schools, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we need to know going into that profession is that people are coming into it with very different philosophical ideas about what education should be. The
Mm-hmm.
only way those conversations can be productive is if I have some knowledge of those other perspectives. So some people are coming in as pragmatists or as religious idealists, right? Or as scientific realists or objectivists, Montessorians. And so we all have to know something about our perspectives in order to have fruitful conversations.
Mm-hmm. Well, you probably pretty much answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Is there anything else you can suggest to help students develop their own objectivity?
Well, yes. I mean, on the cognitive side, there's lots of good material out there about how to pay attention to the data, how to try to look at the data from different perspectives, seeking out the alternative viewpoints, and putting yourself in different intellectual shoes and so on, being aware of what various kinds of cognitive biases that people can be prone to, taking formal courses in logic, statistics, mathematics, and so on, develop your skill set. So our minds potentially are an enormously powerful tool, but you need the tool clean and sharp, and there's always a more powerful version of the tool. You can get the software upgrades, and that can be a lifelong process. The other thing I would say in terms of objectivity is on the character side of cognition. A lot of times, failures of objectivity come from a kind of laziness that objectivity and learning takes work. And we know that. And in many cases, we want the path of least resistance, or we've got a pretty good idea and we just don't want to think about something anymore. So to school yourself to say that it really matters that I have the truth, or at least the best possible answer, and not to be complacent and satisfied with the easy answer or just the first answer that you come across, and so on, to go that extra mile. So in a way, it's kind of like physical conditioning. We can all be kind of pretty good shape and so on, but really to be more ambitious and to work out more frequently. The same thing goes to not be an intellectual couch potato, right, so to speak.
That's good.
But that's a character trait about developing that habit of active mindedness and so on. The other thing is it's about courage, but the negative side of courage, and what courage is all about, is fear. And I think in many cases, a failure of objectivity is because people are afraid. In some cases, they're afraid that they will have to change their minds about something. To them, and that's hard to be able to say, I made a mistake on something. It's just, don't just say it to yourself, let alone to say it publicly, because we know
it bruises your ego a little bit.
It will give you grief about various things. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying it bruises your ego to admit
you
did something that you made a mistake, or that's how a lot of people feel.
Yes, and well, it is in one sense an ego bruising, but the way I like to come back to that is to say it really is the sign of a strong ego to be able to say, I made a mistake.
Yeah.
Because we all make mistakes. We make a huge number of mistakes.
Mhm.
And the sign of a person who actually has strength of character is to be able to say to yourself, I was wrong about that. That's
Mhm.
the fact of the matter. And that really I am interested in truth. I'm interested in improvement. And that signal, that actually is the thing that takes the strong ego.
Mhm.
Or to be willing to go against the flow, because we do
Mhm.
know that our peers exert conformist pressures on us, and
Mhm.
they punish deviancies. And so objectivity often is, if you have some questions or some doubts about what seems to be the prevailing viewpoint,
Mhm.
to let those slide and to suppress them in order to go along with the group. So that becomes a courage issue. How, diplomatically, but nonetheless
Mhm.
firmly stand up for your own thinking and to
Mhm.
raise the questions that are going to make the results more objective. And the other kind of fear that we grapple with is in hierarchical social contexts as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah.
It's hard to challenge our parents, our teachers, our bosses. And actually, again, strong egoed teachers and strong egoed bosses
Mhm.
are going to encourage criticism. They don't want a bunch of conformist mind
Mhm.
followers. Nonetheless, it's hard for students, it's hard for employees
Mhm.
to raise those questions, to say, well, maybe there's a different way of
Yeah.
looking at it. So work on your courage, work on your active mindedness. Those are the two important character complements to
Mhm.
whatever skill sets of objectivity
Right.
uh, one needs to acquire.
Wonderful advice. You know, the person in the last instance where it's your teacher or your employer, you might have some material fear that you're going to lose your position or
Well,
you're going
sure.
to get a bad grade and all that. And the other instances, I always try to encourage people to be loyal to the truth and to get their sense of self-esteem from the fact that they're loyal to the truth. So their
Hmm.
ego is more tied to being loyal to the truth. And in that sense, then when they're wrong and they admit it, they actually can feel kind of good about themselves. Well, I'm being loyal to the truth. I'm proudly admitting that I was wrong because the truth is more important than me believing
Right.
something.
Yeah. And I like the advice that entrepreneurs will often give, to say that if you're not failing a lot, if you're not making a lot of mistakes, you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
And that word is generalized and fits exactly with what you're saying. But then I do think it then becomes a responsibility of good parents, good teachers, and good bosses, because they are all aware that their children, their students, and their employees are worried about sanctions
Yes.
against them if they say the wrong sort of thing, to go out of their way to make it clear that
Hmm.
that's not going to happen, to
Exactly.
actively encourage. And I would actually just say to reward students for
Hmm.
asking uncomfortable questions, and reward employees who raise uncomfortable
Hmm.
questions. I haven't worked this out, but partly on the history, but the idea of the king's fool. So if
Oh
you think of
yeah.
being a king and all of those weighty, incredibly difficult decisions you need to make if you're going to be a good king,
Yeah.
and everybody is aware of your power and that you could have them beheaded at the moment,
Yeah.
to have an official person whose job it is to criticize in a mocking way
Hmm.
whatever it is that you're thinking about, to encourage the fool.
Hmm.
So we all need that. Uh,
Yes. Hmm. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful and very informative conversation,
a
which
pleasure for me too. Yeah,
it-
this is
it's great.
great.
I hope that we can get this conversation out to a lot of people. I think it
Mm,
would be very helpful to parents parents, teachers, and students.
mm.
Um, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday. And once again, I will put all the information, anything that we refer to in the notes to the conversation. I was thinking, for example, there's a blog called Less Wrong that has all kinds of discussions about ways in which we can have cognitive errors and how to make them better. So hope to have a lot of resources for the viewer. And once again, this is sponsored by the Great Connections. We're an educational organization. Please visit our website at thegreatconnections.org. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marsha. A real pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.